So examples of Antiquitech: the Temple of Man, healing manifestation machines, and quantum computer hardware. So this is what I believe that the holistic grand purpose of these buildings or machines were. Sacred architecture and human body resonance. Sacred buildings, temples, cathedrals, and the human body are both designed with principles of resonance, energy generation, and healing in mind. The human body as a bioelectric field interacts with its surroundings, absorbing and emitting energy. Temples aligned with ley lines or cosmic points may amplify local electromagnetic fields, impacting human consciousness and energy. Just as the body has chakras and energy channels, temples use sacred geometry to amplify and direct subtle energies, enhancing the flow and alignment of energy. Temple structure as human anatomy. So sacred buildings often mirror the human body's anatomy, with areas like the altar representing the head or crown, symbolic of higher consciousness, and the nave representing the spine, akin to the body's central energy system. So think of the kundalini, the spine. Geometry is functional technology. The use of sacred geometry such as Fibonacci sequences and golden ratios served more than aesthetic purposes. It was used to stabilize, amplify, and control energy fields, tuning the structure to universal harmonics. Temples as macro versions of the self. The relationship between the temple and man is one of energetic resonance and mirroring. These structures function as larger versions of the human energy system, designed to facilitate subtle energy processes and serve as spaces for alignment and transformation. In this sense, entering a temple could be like activating a macro version of the self. Purpose beyond worship. These buildings were extended beyond religious practice, operating as spiritual technology for energy manipulation, healing, and consciousness enhancement. And temples may have been part of a larger planetary energy network, aligned with cosmic forces for benefit of both human consciousness and the surrounding environment. So I believe the human body is a reality creation machine. I believe through the consciousness of the individual and collective, that the body is used as a reality creation machine, and I will explain the process of reality creating in part 2 of the presentation. And that the mirroring of this sacred anatomy in the buildings themselves are like activating a greater macro version of the self, and by doing so it allows you, through your focused intention, your prayer, as you connect the end terminals of your bioelectrical system, the central nervous system, to your pineal, to your head, to your focused intent. You can amplify that intent through the technology of the buildings, of the machines, so that you can then alter, and this is what I will discuss in part 2, the informational field. In part 2 I will explain the digital physics of the reality that we experience, that everything at its core is information. We are contained within an informational field, and these machines, just as the human body, and when we connect with the machine, allowed us and allows us now to alter the informational field in order to create a reality. And one of the things that I've listened to before from Martin Liedtke, and I do actually like this idea, is that these machines have been hijacked and repurposed, decorated with religious iconography, if that's a church with Christian iconography, a mosque with Islamic iconography, a synagogue with Judaic iconography, these monotheistic religions hijacked these machines, and what happens, it creates an energy Ponzi scheme, is what Martin says. And I really like that idea, and that you go in with the power of being a aspect of the creative oversoul, and you walk into these machines that have the power to influence and augment and manipulate the informational field. But instead of using that power to create your own reality, you pray to a god, you pray to a malevolent god, you pray to the demiurge, the god of these monotheistic Abrahamic religions. And it is ciphering that energy for itself, when you should be using it to connect to the true God, the creator God, the oversoul that lies outside of the informational field that we are contained in. But that will be explained more in part 2. I just think that this again is a very interesting subject to kind of touch base on. This is Wells Cathedral. Again, I live like a few minutes away from this door right here. A lot of symbolic or symbolism on show here. You see these 3 doors. This is something that Masonic researcher Richard Gassaro has explained as the triptych message, and it shows the balance or unification of the 2 opposites in order to experience the Godhead in the middle. So it might be male, female, positive, negative, these different opposites that when interact and are balanced, you walk the golden path in order to experience God through this middle door here. And then here we can see an example of the human body, you know, in comparison to a Gothic church and a Hindu temple. This is the work here of Schwaller de Lubix, who was an archaeologist and researcher in ancient Egypt. He was actually the mentor of John Anthony West, who's one of the most influential ancient Egyptian researchers ever. And Schwaller's book, The Temple of Man, is very, very insightful, but very hard to read and understand. And this here is the Temple of Amun, I believe. The Amun Temple complex, which we will be exploring in part 2, because again, to build off what I was saying, is that I believe that all of these buildings, as being reality creation devices that interact with the informational field, I believe that they are also computer components of a gigantic motherboard of a gigantic quantum computer that the Earth was terraformed to interact with the informational field. Is that our ancient ancestors, they knew that we were in a false reality. That's why they call it the Maya, or the Hindus called it the Maya, the illusion. And they understood that this was an informational field, and they built temples and constructions in order to interact with this informational field through the science of vibration and resonance. And I believe that what happened is that these buildings, when they were online and activated and connected through the global grid, is that they created a resonance in the localized environment that basically upscaled reality as we perceive it through our central nervous system. Think of playing like a PlayStation 1 game with, you know, basic 2D or basic 3D blocky graphics on a standard definition television, and then upgrading that, upscaling that to like modern PlayStation 5 graphics, which are almost lifelike. Imagine the difference between the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 5, and then imagine the difference in the perceptual reality that when all these machines are activated, the resonance that they create, they allow for the upscaling of perceivable reality to essentially render in render in the heavens or render in higher dimensions onto this plane of existence that we exist and interact with. And that is why there's been a systematic destruction of these old world buildings, and that is why especially now, as the introduction of brutalist architecture and less harmonic architecture, it affects the epigenetic response in the body, and the world seems to be becoming less colourful. The world seems to be becoming less alive. And that is because as all this architecture, or the remnants of this architecture, is destroyed, even though it's been decommissioned and it's not functioning the way that it used to, and the Earth grid isn't active, our perception of reality is essentially dying, because these machines are being destroyed and being replaced with something less harmonic, and that creates the epigenetic response on a cellular level on how we perceive reality to be less epic, to be more dull and mediocre. So that's what I'm thinking with that, guys. I will explain more of the quantum computer aspect of all of this in the Earth grid in part 2. And then what I wanted to do with this now is just explore these images in a little bit more detail. I haven't, for a specific reason, on purpose, said where these pictures originate from, where they are, because I don't want to create any bias towards any religion, or I just want you to experience. You can connect with the energy, light is an electromagnetic energy, as we've discussed. You can connect with the energy of this place by just interacting with these photos, just by looking at these photos. How do they make you feel? So I'm just going to be quiet for a bit. I'm just going to scroll through them, and I want you to interact. I want you to feel, like, how do you feel looking at this? Does it make you feel inspired? Does it elevate your soul and consciousness? Or does it not? Does it make you feel closed? Does it make you feel scared, fearful? What feelings does it invoke? So I think it's important to state and understand that architecture is a direct reflection of the level of consciousness that can conceive and create these masterpieces. So when we're looking at these temples and buildings that were built in the last 1,000 years accordingly, or this is here, the Hagia Sophia, thousands upon thousands of years. What are we told about the people of that time frame? What are we told about civilization as a whole, the technology that they had at their disposal? What lies or truths have we been conditioned and programmed to believe about these people? Were these people in a time of war, poverty, famine, or were they in a time of peace and prosperity? I mean, just looking at these buildings, this here, I mean, that, the bottom right, I mean, that's like a DMT trip, you know. You like, look at that, look at the intricacies of that artwork with that beautiful mandala. Wow, crazy. And this is kind of ties into the work of Dr. Ibrahim Karim with biogeometry. I actually had the honor of interviewing Dr. Ibrahim on my podcast, the Red Pill Initiation Hour, a few years back, and we discussed his work with biogeometry, which is the qualitative or the analysis of the qualitative physics of the radiation that form shapes emit, and these buildings produce what he calls the BG3, which are a spectrum of radioactive radiation properties, which consist of what's called horizontal negative green and the higher harmonics of gold and ultraviolet. And these buildings, in the way that they're constructed, the shapes they use, the dimensions, it creates an uplifting atmosphere for spiritual evolution, but then it's also grounding in that it connects you to the earth, to the present moment. And it can be very healing, and they come and by utilizing these three harmonics within the biogeometry spectrum of analysis, they create a native electromagnetic protection from non-native electromagnetic fields. So in a sense, you do get some form of EMF protection when being in these buildings, from my understanding of Dr. Karim's work. And then what Dr. Karim does is he replicates these dimensions into shapes that he then helps with, like house planning, and he was, I believe it was in Switzerland that he was employed by the Swiss government, that a town was suffering from EMF poisoning, and he went and changed the layout of the town and a few of the buildings with the architecture in accordance to these biogeometry principles, and everyone's health skyrocketed, and it helped with natural EMF protection. I may have just butchered that explanation, but off the top of my head, it was a few years ago that I had this conversation with him. That's the closest that I can get to explaining his work. So yeah, if you want to check that out. Yeah, just these buildings. Just interacting with these photos. The architecture, the layout, the colors used. It's beautiful. And then history painted in a completely different light. So a lot of these buildings we could still see over in India with some of the old ancient Hindu temples, but specifically the European cathedrals, they all used to be painted. So here we have Wells Cathedral, and this was built in the 12th century, 13th century, and this is what it originally looked like. It was coloured. And when you look at it again, like I said, with the light and the colour, it affects the electromagnetic spectrum. It affects how you interact with these buildings. And in the 1500s, during the Reformation period and the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry VIII and Cromwell put out an order to abolish all these monasteries, but also all of the cathedrals that were around that were coloured, that were too reminiscent of the ideals of Catholicism. They were all whitewashed. So all of the paint was white, the building was then whitewashed. And then in 1851, again that date, 1851 comes up during the Victorian Restoration period, all of the paint was ordered to be scraped off in what's called the Great Scrape. Now, questions that raise: how do they have access to large-scale paint production to be able to paint these gigantic buildings in the 12th, 13th century? I want to know. And even earlier, when it comes to these Hindu temples. And then the question that is raised is, how did they scrape all that paint off? So it was whitewashed, so it was completely white, and then in the 1850s, 1851, they scrape all that paint off. How do you scrape off all of that paint off the whole building? Seriously, think about that for a second. How do you scrape off all of the paint in 1851? How many people did that take? How long did it take? That seems like an impossible task to me. But you know that it was true, because when you go onto the inside of these cathedrals, all of the inside of the cathedrals used to be painted. And just like with the Egyptian temples, where you see all of the hieroglyphs and it tells a story of the ancient past, our past was displayed inside of these cathedrals. As you would walk through them, you would journey through time, through murals and stained glass windows, and it would tell a story of our true past, of our history. And then all of that was taken from us. It was scraped, it was whitewashed and scraped off. And you can still see some of the remnants. In Wales Cathedral, there's a few walls that have like tiny, like very faint pictures that you can see. In St. Albans Cathedral, you can see it. Some of the churches, you can see faint outlines, but that was unfortunately a part of our history, or at least evidence of our history that has been removed. And this is a polychromed past, the west front of Amiens Cathedral, France, coloured by lasers. So again, this is a laser show that was put on, but look how different the interaction is between yourself and the machine and the building when it's coloured like this. I feel like it invokes much more wonder and awe and fascination, and just it gives it, like, they're already breathtaking when you check them out as they are now, but when it's coloured, it's just a whole different dimension of experience. And then we see here St. Basil's Cathedral in the Red Square in Moscow. I mean, it makes them look like magical, mystical buildings, machines. It invokes that sense of wonder and connection to like the fantasy realms that when we think of like sci-fi fantasy, medieval fantasy with wizards and warlocks, witches, all those mythical beings, the griffins flying around. Like, this is the sort of world that I think of. And then this was the west front of Exeter Cathedral, reconstructed from analysis of paint traces. Again, just the attention to detail. Like, how did these people have the technology in a time, this was in like the time frame of a feudal system. Everyone were just farmers. The church ruled supreme. Everyone was a fucking peasant compared to the monarchy, the church, the upper class. How did they have the resources to do this? So I think that these buildings have been here for a very long time. I think that, as I will explain later on and in part 2 in more detail about cyclical resets that affect this realm and affect civilizations throughout time, that these buildings were found, that they were founded or found dead in mud, and they had to be unburied, unearthed, and a lot of the components were damaged and they were repurposed. And some buildings were repurposed for religious purposes, some buildings were repurposed for public civil use, governmental use, some buildings were taken by the elite as their own households. And yeah, but I think looking at it when it's in colour, just like I said, paints history in a completely different light. And this is a clip from Van Helsing, and I think this is paints the picture, gives a good idea of how all this technology would work in unison. So in this clip you see Frankenstein's monster. He's hooked up to a device at the top of one of these old world buildings, and it gets hit with lightning, and it has to interact with Frankenstein, which is essentially a cyborg, part man, part machine, the body is a machine, but again, all of these machines work holistically with the body. It's a machine-body interaction. And just look at the visuals, and again, just try and visualize this in your mind's eye of like it not being completely fictional. That we have to connect to our imagination to conceive these ideas, and these ideas are part of the collective consciousness or past experiences. Good old Hugh.
My friends are doing it for me. Friends. Yes. You want one? I can ask for the box. This is gonna hurt. I am accustomed to pain.
So you're gonna see now, like the lightning comes down and strikes the antenna. You know, so it might be fictitious and fanciful to believe like such a reality did exist in the past, but I believe, you know, our imagination is connected through the collective consciousness of past experiences, and when we can tap into that, we begin to rediscover aspects of our history and ourself that's been hidden and suppressed. And I do believe that these machines operate in such a way. You look at how the generation of the energy was taken from the natural world, was harnessed and then channeled into giving life. I think that's a really good depiction of what it could have looked like. And of course, empty hall, but all the same architecture. Again, before these buildings were repurposed, they probably were empty like that. And that energy would have flowed through it, and all that energy is then stored within the rock, within the stone. What do you think? What do you think when you look at that?
If you enjoyed this presentation and feel inspired to support both yourself and this channel, then head over to primalalchemy.co.uk. Awaken your potential with the world's only visionary health brand. Discover our collection of tonic herbal elixirs, rare crystals, and holistic health technologies. All chosen and created with intention, so you can focus on the energy you bring into your life. Whether you're grounding yourself, seeking clarity, or elevating your routine, Primal Alchemy supports every step of your journey. Use code REBUS10 for 10% off all superfood elixirs at primalalchemy.co.uk.